Chapter 27. Now, from here on out, most of the stuff I'll be teaching you is stuff I remember from having lived through. I lived through the Vietnam War and the, anyway, much of this stuff I'm familiar with from news, but still it helps to read over it again for me and then get it, because when you listen to the news every day, you get it in bits and pieces and don't know the outcome. Reading about it now, you know outcomes that the people living at the time did not know. Chapter 28. I was on the wrong chapter. The West since 1945. We'll talk in this chapter about Europe first, then Eastern Europe, then Russia, and then Latin America. With the United States next, then Canada, then Latin America. Basically the Western world since 1945. And because your book does so, I'll start off with France. So much of the history of France for the first 20 years, for actually the first 25 years after World War II, so much of the history of France centered around the person of Charles de Gaulle. If you're French, you pronounce those names much different than we do here, but I always call him Charles de Gaulle. The book pronounces it Charles de Gaulle. Anyway, de Gaulle became really popular in France because during World War II, his outfit was the only one that temporarily stopped the German advance. But then Germany kept overrunning and he had to surrender along with everybody else. He was able to get away and flee to Algeria and organize a resistance in Algeria. But France was, for all practical purposes, effectively knocked out of the war. But his unit held out longer than the other. When the war was over, he stayed out of politics because he didn't like the way France was going. Then he entered politics when France began to fall apart, and it was felt like he was the one man who could put together. And the first thing he did was ask the French Parliament to give him all kinds of power as president, to where he could rule almost as a dictator. Now, if that sounds a lot like Adolf Hitler, you may be right. But he tried to create a socialistic state in France that seemed to work for a little while. But your book says France's experiment with socialism largely failed. And here was the problem. And of course, I'm looking at this straight out of the book. For instance, the factories and the mines, the coal mines, which were a big part of France's industry. A typical coal miner felt like, hey, I'm going to get paid the same, and I'm guaranteed a job, so why should I try hard? I'm going to get paid the same as that shirker over there. And I'm not going to get promoted based on any merit of mine. If I get promoted at all, it'll be based on seniority. So why work hard? Why produce? There was little incentive. And again, this is a complaint that socialists have made universally. And the result was France's economic decline continued. Eventually, Charles de Gaulle asked the French people to give him even more power. He said, the problem is I don't have enough power to end your economic turndown. Give me more power. If you don't, I'll resign. The French people refused in a national referendum, and de Gaulle resigned. Within a year after he resigned, he went into retirement. Within a year after he retired, he was dead. A lesson on retirement, folks. Now, none of you look like you're thinking about retirement, but I want to tell you something. My dad died 11 days after he retired. Sudden heart attack. Bear Bryant lived 1 month. Bear Bryant was a famous Alabama football coach, lived 1 month after he retired. there's something about that word retire that when you hear it, it's like your body shuts down. Have any of you heard this from other sources? I mean, at least one of you. Yeah, two of you. Yeah. In other words, you might change careers late in life like I did, but don't quit.
Right.
When you quit, your body is going to shut down and you're going to be gone quickly. De Gaulle quit. Now, something else about De Gaulle your book does not mention. This is something I read one time. At home, De Gaulle was henpecked. But his wife told him repeatedly, you run France, but here at home, I run the house. And he was the 4-star general in France's army, as well as being like the ruler, sole dictator of France, but at home, he was in charge of nothing. I mean, it reminds me of the Beetle Bailey comics, where the general is controlled by his wife. Both happens more than once. Cyrus the great conqueror of most of the known world at that time, he was controlled by his wife at home. It's not unheard of. Anyway, when De Gaulle retired, Mitterrand took over. I'm not going to write that name down. The one thing, though, I want you to remember about Europe, and this is as true in France as anywhere else, they embraced socialism. And they still do. Now, they had just fought a big war against socialism. They fought a war against Hitler, fought a war against Mussolini. And then once the war was over, they jumped headlong into the cauldron of socialism. And folk, I can't say that it worked. In fact, I challenge any of you to find a real instance where socialism has worked. The goal is to share our wealth, but what winds up is we all wind up sharing our poverty. Or socialism works, so this is Margaret Thatcher's quote, socialism works until you run out of other people's money to spend. When their money runs out, the persons who earned it, then socialism fails. Anyway, now, something else I want to mention about France before moving on. Like every other nation, when the war was over, there was a baby boom. But then the alarmists began preaching the doctrine, as I think all of you have heard it, there are too many people in the world, we must limit, we must curb our population. The French did extremely well at curbing its population growth. And then they realized they didn't have enough workers to work their mines, their factories, or their infrastructure. So they began to call in foreign workers who were mostly Muslim. The Muslims did not blend in very well with the rest of the population. And folk, what I'm teaching here is standard history. This is not my, and it's in the book also. So for those of you who have read the book, know I've already read what I'm talking about. But they didn't blend in very well. Then they started rioting because the people quit hiring them. And at some points in places in France, 50% of your young Muslim men are unemployed. The women seem to be able to find jobs better when they are allowed to work. Now, of course, the Muslims are against women working outside the home. But, so the Muslims began to riot. Also, a lot of rioting that involved college students. College students rioted against poverty. Now, not like the ones in the United States who at the same time were rioting against the Vietnam War, but this time France was totally out of Vietnam, having lost Vietnam. And France continued to decline. Now, I must mention that France lost its colonies abroad. They finally gave up and gave Iraq their independence, but they still maintain ties with Iran and Iraq. And they're still involved in the Middle East, but they gave them their independence. They were kicked out of Vietnam, and for all practical purposes, they were kicked out of Algeria. A lot of French had moved to Algeria since France had conquered Algeria in 1830, and the Muslims began to come in and terrorize them and forced every one of them to leave Algeria. Nevertheless, France still has some ties with Algeria. De Gaulle had dreams of restoring France to the greatness that it once had been, But the problem was, during de Gaulle's life, France had shown nothing about greatness. When about the time de Gaulle was born, France got clobbered in the Franco-Prussian War. World War I, they held off. They had to have help from Britain and the United States and Italy to defeat Germany. World War II, they got clobbered. And then after World War II, they were driven out of Vietnam and driven out of Algeria. So France was everything but great. All right. Germany. Germany's recovery was remarkable, at least the West Germany. Now, Germany was divided into West and East for a long time. East Germany was under communism. West Germany was the most capitalistic place there was, I mean, having gone through socialism under Hitler. The West Germans became industrialists, and even though they had about 50% of the land that they had before the war, they actually exceeded their industrial output in short order. So West Germany was prospering fairly well as long as they were divided, while East Germany was starving. Then in 1990, East Germany and West Germany united, and oh, they were just thrilled. But there quickly developed problems. They said that the East Germans had had a unit of coinage called the mark, just like the West Germans. They said, you can trade your marks in for our Western marks so that we'll all be under the same monetary system and trade them in at equal value. Well, folk would be like somebody offering, hey, you give me your pennies and I'll give you dollar bills for your pennies. I mean, it was that bad. It'd be like if we were to join with Mexico and say, hey, we'll trade you your pesos, $1 for every peso, and we give them $1. Well, what would happen is the value of our dollar would go down drastically. So when it turned out about 1/4 of the people living in Germany were East Germans, and when they turned in their marks for supposedly the more valuable West German marks, it brought the value of the whole mark crashing down. And from that day to this, Germany has not fully recovered. It was then found out that a bunch of East Germans had been hired as spies for the communists. Essentially, brother would spy on brother, and if you had a relative living in if you were an East German and had a relative in West German, you would correspond, but you would be spying for your own government. The German people some of them were outraged, so let's bring these people to trial for spying on their family and for spying on us. But most Germans said, no, that was under a different system. Let's all just move forward, forget about it. And eventually that's what most of the Germans did, just simply said, we'll forgive and write off all your past indiscretions. Let's move forward.